The 8-foot giant cowboy laughed at breeding with the teacher. Until she got pregnant, Redstone was the kind of small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, and nothing exciting ever seemed to happen. The streets were dusty, and the buildings were simple, made of wood and stone that had withstood decades of sun, wind, and rain. The town had a general store that sold everything from flour to rope, a tiny post office with a bell that jingled every time the door opened, and a few ranches scattered around the outskirts. Children ran freely through the dirt streets after school, and neighbors often gathered in the evenings to share stories or watch the sun dip behind the distant hills. Life here was slow, predictable, and comfortable, but it was also quiet, maybe too quiet for some. One early morning, a strange shadow fell across Redstone's main street. People squinted, shading their eyes, trying to make out who or what was coming down the road. It wasn't just another traveler or a dusty stagecoach passing through. This was different. Tall, wider than anyone had ever seen in town, the figure seemed almost larger than life. His boots made a rhythmic thud against the wooden boardwalk, each step echoing with authority. By the time he reached the general store, the townsfolk were murmuring among themselves. This was Jeb Granger, though most people would soon call him Tallman. Jeb wasn't just tall, he was enormous, standing at an incredible 8 feet. His long arms and broad shoulders made him look like a man carved from the earth itself, as if nature had decided to create a human giant just for Redstone. Despite his size, there was something approachable about him. His eyes were warm, a soft brown that invited conversation rather than fear. He had a calm smile, the kind that made people feel like they had known him their entire lives, even if they had just seen him on the dusty road. The first people Jeb met were the children outside the general store. They had been playing tag, kicking up small clouds of dust, when the shadow of his hat stretched over them. The kids froze, unsure if they should run or greet this towering newcomer. Jeb knelt slightly to their level, still impossibly tall, and tipped his wide-brimmed hat. "Morning, little ones," he said in a voice that rumbled like distant thunder but was surprisingly gentle. "Name, Jeb, I hear you've got some strong legs for running." The children laughed nervously, glancing at each other, unsure how to respond. One of them, a boy named Tommy, stepped forward bravely. "You're really tall," he said, almost whispering. Jeb chuckled, a sound that filled the air like warm sunlight. "That I am, son. But don't worry, I'm friendly, just passing through town." Meanwhile, inside the small schoolhouse on the corner of Main Street, Clara Benson was already at work. Clara was young, with chestnut hair always neatly tied back, and a calm demeanor that made her students feel safe and respected. She had a sharp mind and an even sharper sense of humor, though most of her wit was reserved for private moments or the occasional playful teasing of her students. Today, she was preparing lessons on arithmetic and reading comprehension, humming softly to herself as she organized papers and checked the children's homework. It wasn't unusual for Clara to notice unusual events in town. Redstone's Main Street didn't often see anything out of the ordinary. But she had no idea that her quiet morning was about to be interrupted in the most extraordinary way. The schoolhouse windows rattled slightly as a loud, rhythmic thumping grew closer. The sound was unlike the usual hooves of a horse or the creaking of a wagon. It was heavier, more deliberate. Curious, Clara walked to the window and peered outside. At first, she couldn't believe her eyes. A man, impossibly tall and broad, was making his way down the street. She had heard of tall people, of course, but nothing compared to what she was seeing. He looked almost like one of the giants from the old storybooks, but the smile on his face made him seem friendly rather than frightening. Clara stepped back from the window and rubbed her eyes, wondering if it was some trick of the morning sun. But no, he was real. The children noticed her pause and crowded around, their eyes wide with amazement. "Who is that?" whispered one of the girls, pointing at Jeb as he approached the store. "I don't know," Clara replied, her voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "But he looks different." Jeb finally stopped in front of the general store and pushed open the door. The bell jingled, and the townspeople inside turned to face him. Their reactions were a mixture of awe and curiosity. Jeb moved with surprising grace for someone his size, careful not to knock over the display of canned goods near the entrance. "Morning, folks," Jeb said, his deep voice friendly. "I'm looking for supplies and maybe a little advice. I hear this town knows its way around a good cattle drive. The storekeeper, a middle-aged man named Hank, blinked rapidly. "Well, you heard right, but you don't see many folks like you around here. 8 feet, is it?" "Close enough," Jeb replied with a wink, brushing dust from his coat. "I go by Jeb. Folks call me Tallman." As Jeb shopped, the town buzzed with conversation. People whispered about him, speculating where he came from and what stories he might have. Rumors traveled fast in Redstone, and by the time Jeb had finished his purchase, nearly the entire town had come outside to catch a glimpse of the legendary giant. Curiosity turned into excitement when Clara, now having gathered her courage, stepped outside. She had always believed that education and kindness could overcome fear, and today she wanted to greet this unusual visitor herself. Adjusting her modest hat, she walked toward him. "Hello," she said, her voice steady but polite. "Welcome to Redstone. I'm Clara Benson, teacher at the schoolhouse over there." She pointed to the corner building, her gaze steady on the giant. Jeb looked down at her and a smile spread across his face. "Pleasure to meet you, Miss Benson. I've heard this town has a good reputation for kindness, and I can see it's true." Clara felt a small blush rise to her cheeks. It wasn't every day a man who could easily reach the roof of a one-story building complimented her personally. She motioned toward the schoolhouse. "Well, if you have a few minutes, I could show you around. You might even meet some of my students. They love new faces." Jeb's eyes twinkled. "I'd like that, though I'm not sure they're ready for someone my size." Clara laughed, the sound clear and warm. "I think they'll manage. Kids are tougher than most grown-ups give them credit for." Over the next hour, Jeb and Clara walked around the small schoolyard. Jeb was careful not to step too hard on the loose stones or knock over anything accidentally. Clara noticed how aware he was of his size, and she found herself admiring not just his strength but his gentle nature. The children, after an initial hesitation, began to warm up to him. Some climbed onto his massive shoulders to see the tops of the swings, and Jeb laughed in a way that was full of joy, a deep, booming sound that made the ground seem to hum slightly. As they walked, Clara asked about his life. Jeb shared stories of ranching, long journeys across plains and mountains, and the quiet times he spent thinking under the stars. He spoke with a humor that was natural and effortless, often making Clara laugh in ways she hadn't in a long time. "Do you always joke about everything?" Clara asked once as he pretended to struggle lifting a bag of flour. "Not everything," Jeb said, grinning, "but life's too short not to laugh a little, don't you think?" Clara nodded thoughtfully. "I suppose you're right. I just never expected someone so large to have such a light-hearted spirit." Jeb chuckled, and there was a pause, a comfortable, almost magical silence. Clara felt a strange mix of admiration and curiosity. There was something about this giant man that was both extraordinary and completely human, a combination that left her intrigued. By the time the sun had climbed high into the sky, the townspeople had largely returned to their routines, but whispers of the giant cowboy and the teacher persisted. Children ran home to tell their families about the new visitor, and adults speculated on whether he would stay or move on. Jeb, however, had no immediate plans. He enjoyed Redstone's calm and Clara's company. As he left the schoolhouse, he tipped his hat once more. "Thank you, Miss Benson. I hope to see you again soon." Clara smiled, watching him walk away, and felt a strange anticipation she couldn't quite explain. There was something about Jeb Granger that promised adventure, change, and maybe even a story that Redstone would never forget. The day had begun like any other in the small town, but with Jeb's arrival, it was clear that life in Redstone was about to become far more interesting than anyone could have imagined. After that first meeting at the schoolhouse, life in Redstone slowly returned to its usual rhythm. The children went back to their lessons, the townspeople to their daily chores, and the sun continued to shine over the dusty streets. Yet for Clara Benson, there was a new sense of anticipation she hadn't expected. She found herself thinking about Jeb Granger, Tallman, as the children now called him, more often than she cared to admit. It wasn't just his height that fascinated her. Plenty of people were tall. It was the combination of his size, his gentle humor, and the warmth in his eyes. There was something about the way he spoke to the children, not as if he were a giant to be feared, but as if he were one of them, only bigger. Even the townsfolk, who were often wary of outsiders, couldn't help but notice how natural and unpretentious he seemed. Over the next few days, Jeb made himself seen around town. He visited the general store almost daily, often chatting with the storekeeper and exchanging jokes with the regular customers. At first, Clara would see him from a distance, watching as he laughed with children or helped an elderly neighbor carry a heavy load of firewood. She noticed how careful he was, how he adjusted his movements so he wouldn't accidentally bump into anyone or damage the smaller, fragile items in town. One morning, Clara decided she could no longer resist speaking with him again. She found herself walking down Main Street earlier than usual, carrying a basket of papers and some freshly baked bread she intended to take to her neighbor, Mrs. Harper. As she turned the corner near the general store, there was Jeb, standing tall and leaning against the store's wooden post, the sunlight glinting off his wide-brimmed hat. "Good morning, Miss Benson," Jeb called out in his deep, cheerful voice. "I was just thinking about how quiet it gets in Redstone. You've got a peaceful town here, but it could use a bit more excitement." Clara smiled, feeling her cheeks warm. "Excitement is dangerous, Mr. Granger. People around here like things to stay predictable." "Predictable has its charm," he admitted, tilting his head. "But I think there's room for a little adventure." They laughed together, the sound blending naturally with the creak of the store doors and the distant crowing of roosters. Clara noticed, as she often did, how his laughter seemed to fill the space around him. It was a full, resonant sound that could lift spirits and make even the dullest mornings feel alive. Over the next few weeks, Jeb and Clara began to see each other more frequently, sometimes intentionally, sometimes by chance. The first intentional meeting happened one afternoon at the river that ran along the outskirts of Redstone. Clara had gone there to collect water lilies for a class project. She had her notebook and pencils in hand, ready to teach her students about the beauty of local plants. Jeb was there too, though not for the flowers. He was repairing a small section of the riverbank that had been damaged during the last storm. Clara approached cautiously, noting how careful he was with the soil and rocks. Even with his immense strength, he moved as though he were handling something delicate. "You're strong," Clara said, breaking the silence, "but you're also careful. I didn't expect that combination." Jeb looked up and smiled. "I've learned that being careful doesn't make you weak, it makes you reliable. And sometimes that's more important than being fast or powerful." Clara nodded thoughtfully. There was wisdom in his words, and she felt a connection forming, one that went beyond curiosity or fascination. They spent hours talking that afternoon, sharing stories of their childhoods, the challenges they had faced, and the small joys that kept life meaningful. Clara spoke of her years as a teacher, the frustrations of trying to teach children who sometimes didn't want to learn, and the pride she felt when one of them finally understood a difficult concept. Jeb listened attentively, asking questions and laughing at the appropriate moments. He shared stories of ranching, of long days in the sun, of nights spent under a blanket of stars listening to the wind. By the time the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink, Clara realized she had lost track of time. She felt a strange warmth in her chest, a mix of admiration, respect, and a curiosity she hadn't felt before. Jeb, too, seemed reluctant to leave. He looked at her with a soft expression, one that made it clear he valued her company far more than he had expected. In the following days, their encounters became more frequent. Sometimes it was a brief meeting at the general store. Other times, it was a longer conversation by the river or in the schoolyard after classes ended. They discussed everything from the practical, how to care for cattle, how to teach multiplication, to the personal, dreams, fears, and the small moments that made life meaningful. The children of Redstone began to notice the growing friendship as well. They would whisper and giggle whenever Jeb and Clara were together, often trying to peek around corners to watch their interactions. Some of the braver children would approach Jeb, asking him to lift them onto his shoulders or tell a story about his travels. He always obliged, laughing and making sure each child felt special and included. Clara observed these moments with a mixture of amusement and admiration. She noticed how patient he was, how he took the time to make each interaction genuine. It was rare to see someone so physically imposing also be so gentle and approachable. One evening, after a long day of lessons, Clara found herself walking home with her notebook clutched to her chest. The sky was painted with the soft colors of sunset, and the air was warm but not oppressive. She rounded the corner near the general store and was surprised to see Jeb standing there, leaning against the post as he often did. "Evening, Miss Benson," he greeted. "Out for a walk." Yes, she replied, smiling, collecting my thoughts. Jeb nodded. Mind if I join you? Clara hesitated for a moment. She was used to walking alone, reflecting on her day, but there was something comforting about Jeb's presence. All right, she said finally. They walked side by side through the quiet streets, talking about their days and laughing over small jokes. Clara found that she could speak freely with him, sharing thoughts she didn't usually reveal to anyone. Jeb listened with patience, never interrupting, never judging. It was a kind of companionship she hadn't realized she had been missing. As the days turned into weeks, Clara began to notice subtle changes in her feelings. She looked forward to seeing Jeb each day, to their conversations, to the way he made even the most mundane moments feel interesting. And Jeb, for his part, seemed to carry a quiet anticipation as well, often finding reasons to stop by the school or the river, always with a warm greeting and a smile. One afternoon, the two of them decided to take a short trip outside of town to visit a nearby canyon. It was a place Jeb had loved since he was a child, a place where the wind whistled through the rocks and the world felt endless. Clara had never been, and she agreed eagerly, intrigued by the promise of adventure and beauty. The hike was challenging but manageable. Clara was careful with each step, and Jeb matched her pace, making sure she felt safe. Along the way, they talked about their families, their hopes for the future, and the kinds of lives they wanted to lead. The canyon was breathtaking, the colors of the rocks shifting with the sun, and Clara felt a sense of awe that she had never experienced before. At the edge of the canyon, they sat on a large rock, overlooking the valley below. The wind tugged at Clara's hair, and she felt a rush of exhilaration. Jeb sat beside her, his massive presence both comforting and reassuring. "This is beautiful," Clara said softly. "Yes," Jeb replied. "It reminds me that there's more to life than what we see every day. That there's always room for new experiences, new connections." Clara glanced at him, noticing the sincerity in his expression. She realized that Jeb was not just a giant in size, but a giant in heart and spirit as well. Over time, the friendship between Jeb and Clara deepened. They began to rely on each other, sharing small moments that brought joy and comfort. Clara found herself smiling more often, laughing more freely, and feeling a sense of connection that was rare in her quiet, predictable life. Jeb, too, found that he was no longer just a visitor passing through Redstone. He felt a sense of belonging, a feeling that he was part of something meaningful, something beyond his own journey. The townspeople noticed the bond as well. While some whispered about the unusual pairing, most recognized the genuine respect and care they had for each other. Children would wave enthusiastically whenever they saw the two together, and even the adults began to warm to the idea of the giant cowboy and the thoughtful teacher, forming a friendship that seemed both unexpected and natural. By the end of the season, Jeb and Clara had established a routine. They would meet at the river, walk through the streets, visit the canyon, or simply sit and talk about their days. Each interaction was filled with laughter, curiosity, and a growing sense of trust. They were careful to respect each other's boundaries, but the connection between them was undeniable. Clara often reflected on how much had changed since Jeb first arrived. The quiet town of Redstone had become more vibrant in her eyes, not because of any grand events, but because of the simple presence of someone who truly cared about the people around him. And Jeb, who had laughed at life and kept others at a distance, found himself drawn to a person who understood him in ways he hadn't expected. The foundation for something extraordinary had been laid, built not on impulse or chance alone, but on genuine friendship, respect, and the shared discovery of life's beauty in even the smallest moments. As the weeks passed, the friendship between Jeb and Clara grew stronger, and the townspeople began to notice. Redstone, which had always been a quiet, predictable place, was now buzzing with subtle whispers about the tall cowboy and the young teacher. Children would point and giggle when Jeb passed by, and adults would sometimes shake their heads in disbelief, wondering how two people so different could spend so much time together. Yet, despite the murmurs, the bond between Jeb and Clara remained unaffected. It was a late summer afternoon when things began to shift. The sun hung low in the sky, painting the streets with gold and orange hues, and the air carried the scent of fresh hay from nearby ranches. Clara had just finished her lessons and was walking toward the schoolhouse garden, where she liked to tend the flowers after class. She found Jeb already there, kneeling by a small patch of marigolds and daisies. "Afternoon, Miss Benson," he said warmly, looking up with that familiar smile. "I thought I'd see what you've been working on today." Clara smiled back, feeling a flutter of nervous excitement. "You're always around when I least expect it," she said, placing her basket of tools down. "The flowers appreciate the attention, though. They grow better when someone cares for them." Jeb chuckled, his deep voice carrying over the garden. "Much like people," he said. "They flourish when someone notices them and treats them with respect." The remark caught Clara off guard. There was something deeper in his words, a weight that made her pause. She looked at him, noticing the softness in his eyes, the careful way he moved even with his massive frame. It was as if he was aware of the delicate balance between strength and gentleness, and it made her feel both curious and cautious. They worked together in silence for a while, planting seeds and watering the soil. The rhythm of their movements and the warm sunlight created a peaceful atmosphere. Clara found herself stealing glances at Jeb, noticing the lines of concentration on his face and the way his enormous hands moved with surprising precision. There was an intimacy in the shared task, a quiet connection that words didn't need to express. When they finished, they sat on a bench near the garden, catching their breath and enjoying the late afternoon warmth. Clara noticed how comfortable she felt with him, how easy it was to share her thoughts and dreams without fear of judgment. Jeb, too, seemed at ease, leaning back with his arms stretched across the bench, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Clara," he said after a while, his voice quieter than usual, "can I ask you something?" "Of course," she replied, turning to face him. He hesitated, as if choosing his words carefully. "Have you ever felt like life could be different, better, if you took a chance on something unexpected?" Clara considered his question. She thought about her quiet days, the routines she had followed for years, and the small moments of joy she had found in teaching. "I think everyone feels that way sometimes," she said softly. "But taking a chance, it's not always easy. Especially when the consequences are unknown." Jeb nodded, understanding in his expression. "I know. I've spent most of my life moving from place to place, avoiding attachments because I feared what could happen. But with you, I feel like I can take a chance. I feel like I can be myself without pretending." Clara felt a warmth in her chest, a mixture of admiration and uncertainty. She had never encountered someone like Jeb, someone who combined strength with such openness and honesty. Yet she also felt the weight of the situation. Life in Redstone was simple and predictable, and a connection like theirs could bring complications, both for them and for the people around them. As the sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of pink and lavender, Jeb reached out and gently touched her hand. The gesture was careful, respectful, and full of meaning. Clara didn't pull away. Instead, she felt a rush of emotion, something tender, something she had tried to ignore but could no longer deny. Over the next few days, the closeness between them grew. They spent more time together, sharing meals, walking along the riverbank, and exploring the outskirts of town. Each encounter deepened their understanding of one another, building trust and a sense of companionship that neither had anticipated. Yet amid the growing warmth, there was also an undercurrent of tension, a mixture of desire, uncertainty, and the fear of what their feelings might mean. One evening, after a long day of teaching, Clara found herself walking toward the river, her mind preoccupied with thoughts of Jeb. The sky was tinged with the last light of sunset, and the air carried a gentle breeze. She saw Jeb waiting near the water's edge, his silhouette tall and imposing against the colorful sky. "Evening," he called softly, noticing her approach. "Evening," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with emotion. They walked together along the river, the silence between them comfortable and filled with unspoken understanding. Clara felt the connection growing stronger, and for the first time, she allowed herself to consider the possibility that this bond could be more than friendship. As they reached a quiet spot by the riverbank, Jeb stopped and turned to face her. "Clara," he said, his voice low and sincere, "I've never met anyone like you. You make me want to be better, to care more, to take risks I've avoided my whole life. I don't know where this will lead, but I do know I don't want to imagine a life without you in it." Clara felt her heart race. She had been trying to keep her feelings in check, to maintain a sense of caution and practicality. Yet in that moment she realized that she had already allowed herself to care deeply for him. "Jeb," she whispered, "I feel the same. I've been trying to be careful, but I can't ignore how much you mean to me." The honesty in their words created a fragile, delicate bond. They sat together, talking quietly as the stars began to appear in the night sky. There was no rush, no pressure, just a shared understanding that something significant was unfolding between them. Despite the depth of their feelings, both Clara and Jeb knew they had to navigate this new stage carefully. The town was watching, and the consequences of their growing closeness were real. They spent the following days balancing their friendship with the emerging emotions, careful not to let the excitement cloud their judgment. One afternoon, while walking through the schoolyard, Clara reflected on how much had changed in her life. Jeb's presence had brought a sense of adventure, joy, and connection that she had never experienced before. Yet, she also felt the weight of responsibility, the need to remain thoughtful and measured, to consider the impact of their actions on themselves and those around them. Jeb, too, was aware of the challenges. He had always been independent, moving from place to place, avoiding attachments. Yet, for the first time, he felt a desire to stay, to invest in something meaningful, to be part of a life that included another person. The awareness of his own emotions, combined with the growing affection for Clara, created a tension he hadn't felt before, a mix of excitement, fear, and determination. As summer began to fade into early autumn, the bond between them strengthened further. They shared long conversations by the river, quiet walks through the fields, and moments of laughter and gentle teasing. Each interaction deepened their understanding, trust, and emotional connection. The town continued its routines, but the presence of Jeb and Clara together added a new energy to Redstone, a sense that life could be richer, fuller, and more vibrant than anyone had imagined. One evening, as the sky darkened and the first stars appeared, Jeb and Clara found themselves sitting on the edge of the canyon once again. The view was breathtaking, the world below bathed in soft moonlight. They talked about their hopes, fears, and the lives they wanted to lead. Clara turned to Jeb, her voice soft. "I never imagined my life could be like this, unexpected, exciting, and full of possibility." Jeb smiled, reaching out to take her hand. "Neither did I. But I think the best things in life are often the ones we never expect. We just have to be brave enough to embrace them." The moment was quiet, filled with a sense of shared understanding and emotional intimacy. Both Clara and Jeb recognized the importance of what they were building, a bond based on trust, respect, and growing affection. They knew challenges lay ahead, but in that moment the future felt full of promise. As they walked back toward town under the starry sky, Clara felt a sense of anticipation and excitement. She knew that life was about to change in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Jeb, too, felt the weight and the thrill of possibility, aware that their connection was no longer just friendship, but the beginning of something deeper and more meaningful. The season's end brought with it a mixture of reflection and anticipation. Both Clara and Jeb had discovered emotions they had not expected, feelings that would challenge them and shape the next phase of their lives. They had grown closer, learned to trust each other, and built a foundation that promised both joy and responsibility. Redstone remained a quiet, small town, but for Clara and Jeb, it had become a place where life could be fuller, more vibrant, and more meaningful than either had ever imagined. The days of simple friendship were giving way to deeper emotions, and both of them knew that the next chapter would bring both joy and challenges they had yet to face. The early days of autumn brought a soft chill to Redstone. The sun still shone warmly in the afternoons, but the mornings were crisp, carrying the scent of fallen leaves and the distant smell of wood smoke from fireplaces. The town had settled back into its quiet rhythm, but for Clara Benson and Jeb Granger, life had taken a turn that made each day feel brighter and more meaningful. Their bond had grown deeper than either could have imagined. What had begun as friendship had evolved into a subtle, unspoken closeness. They spent their days together, walking along the river, tending the school garden, and sharing stories of their pasts, hopes, and fears. Each moment was filled with laughter, gentle teasing, and a comforting sense of understanding. Yet, beneath the warmth, there was a tension neither could ignore, a sense that life was changing, and with change came responsibility and consequences. One late afternoon, Clara found herself in the schoolhouse garden, arranging flowers in neat rows. The golden sunlight painted everything in a soft glow, and she breathed deeply, enjoying the quiet. She heard the familiar sound of boots approaching on the wooden boardwalk. Looking up, she saw Jeb standing tall at the edge of the garden, his shadow stretching across the soil. "Hello, Miss Benson," he called, his voice low and warm. "Thought I'd see how the flowers are doing." Clara smiled, feeling a familiar warmth in her chest. "They're doing well thanks to your advice, but I think they'd grow even better with a little more sunlight and care." Jeb laughed, the deep, resonant sound filling the quiet air. "I can manage both," he said, kneeling beside the flower beds to help her adjust the soil and remove weeds. Together, they worked in a comfortable silence, the rhythm of their movements sinking in an almost effortless harmony. After a while, they sat on the edge of the garden, tired but content. Jeb leaned back on his hands, looking at the sky as it shifted from gold to the soft purples and pinks of sunset. Clara watched him, noticing the way his eyes softened in the fading light, the quiet strength that radiated from him. "You know," Jeb began, turning to face her, "I never imagined I could feel this, connected to someone. Life has always been about moving, working, and staying on my own path. But with you, I feel like I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Clara felt a lump in her throat. She had thought about this moment countless times, wondering if he felt the same way she did. "I feel the same," she admitted softly. "You make life feel fuller, more real." Their eyes met, and in that quiet moment words were no longer necessary. The bond they had built over weeks of shared laughter, trust, and quiet understanding had grown into something deeper, something neither of them could ignore. As the days passed, their connection became more apparent, not just to themselves but to the town as well. Redstone's residents watched with curiosity as the tall cowboy and the young teacher spent increasing amounts of time together. Some whispered in surprise, others in admiration, and a few in gentle disapproval. But Jeb and Clara were aware of the attention and chose to focus on the bond they shared, rather than the opinions of others. It was during one of their evening walks along the river that Clara realized just how much her life had changed. The water flowed quietly, reflecting the colors of the sky, and the gentle rustle of leaves created a peaceful backdrop. She felt a sense of anticipation, a quiet excitement for what the future might hold. "Jeb," she said, breaking the comfortable silence, "have you ever thought about the next steps in life, about building something more permanent?" Jeb stopped walking and looked at her, his eyes steady. "I've thought about it," he admitted. "I've always been cautious, afraid of what could happen if I let someone in. But with you, Clara, I feel ready. I want to face whatever comes next together." Clara felt her heart swell. The thought of committing fully, of building a life with him, filled her with both excitement and a touch of nervousness. "I feel ready too," she whispered, taking his hand in hers. The warmth of his touch grounded her, making her feel safe and cherished. Weeks later, their closeness led to a pivotal moment that neither of them had anticipated. One calm evening, after a long day of teaching and ranch work, they found themselves alone under a sky filled with stars. The town was quiet, and the air carried the soft scent of autumn leaves and distant fires. They talked about their lives, sharing hopes, fears, and dreams in a way that felt both natural and inevitable. In a quiet moment of vulnerability and trust, their bond deepened in a way that would change the course of their lives. The moment was tender, respectful, and full of meaning, a culmination of the weeks they had spent growing closer, learning to trust, and discovering the depth of their feelings for one another. A few weeks after that evening, Clara began to notice changes in her life that filled her with both wonder and apprehension. She had always been cautious and methodical, yet now she found herself imagining the future in a way she never had before. The realization that life was moving forward in an unexpected way brought with it both excitement and responsibility. When Clara discovered she was expecting, the news was both surprising and profound. She sat quietly in her small home, contemplating the change that was unfolding in her life. Her mind raced with questions and possibilities, but amidst the uncertainty, there was a sense of calm determination. She knew that this new chapter would require courage, patience, and unwavering care. Jeb's reaction was one of quiet awe. When Clara told him, he was initially speechless, overwhelmed by the gravity and significance of the moment. Yet beneath the surprise was a profound sense of commitment and love. He placed his hands on hers, looking into her eyes with sincerity and warmth. "We'll face this together," he said simply. "No matter what comes, I'm here. You're not alone." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, a mixture of relief, joy, and gratitude. In that moment, she understood the depth of their connection, not just as companions, but as partners ready to embrace the challenges and joys of life together. The following months were filled with preparation, care, and reflection. Clara continued her teaching, supported by Jeb, who balanced his ranch work with helping her in practical ways. They prepared a small room in her home, arranging furniture, soft blankets, and warm lighting for the arrival of their child. Every action, every conversation, strengthened their bond and reinforced the sense of partnership that had grown between them. The townspeople, once curious observers, began to offer their support as well. Some provided advice, others shared gifts and small gestures of kindness. The initial whispers of surprise faded as people recognized the genuine commitment and care Jeb and Clara had for one another. The community became part of the story, adding warmth and encouragement to the unfolding chapter of their lives. As Clara's pregnancy progressed, both she and Jeb experienced moments of reflection and anticipation. They spoke often about their hopes for the future, the kind of parents they wanted to be, and the values they hoped to pass on to their child. There was joy in planning, wonder in imagining, and a profound sense of responsibility that grounded them in their actions and decisions. One evening, as the first snow of early winter began to fall softly outside, Clara and Jeb sat by the fireplace, hands intertwined, sharing stories of their past and dreams of the future. The room was warm, filled with the soft glow of the fire and the quiet rhythm of falling snow. They spoke of the child they were expecting, imagining the laughter, curiosity, and joy that would soon fill their home. "This child will be surrounded by love," Jeb said quietly, looking into Clara's eyes. "We'll do everything we can to make sure they grow strong, kind, and happy." Clara nodded, feeling a sense of peace she had never known before. "Yes," she said softly. "We'll face everything together, just like we have from the start." When the day finally arrived, the small home in Redstone was filled with anticipation and quiet excitement. Clara gave birth to a healthy, strong baby, a child who inherited the curiosity, warmth, and resilience of both parents. Jeb was by her side throughout, holding her hand, offering encouragement, and marveling at the tiny life they had created together. The birth marked a profound transformation for both of them. Jeb, once a wandering cowboy who had laughed at the thought of attachments, now embraced the responsibilities of fatherhood with humility and dedication. Clara, who had been cautious and reflective, became a confident, loving mother, guided by intuition, care, and a growing sense of purpose. Life in Redstone continued, but for Jeb, Clara, and their child, every day was filled with new meaning. They faced challenges together, celebrated small victories, and found joy in the ordinary moments that made life extraordinary. Their home became a place of warmth, laughter, and learning, where love and respect guided every decision and every interaction. Over time, the story of the giant cowboy and the teacher became part of Redstone's history, not as gossip, but as a tale of love, growth, and unexpected joy. The town came to recognize that life's most meaningful moments often arise from chance encounters, deep connections, and the courage to embrace the unknown. For Clara and Jeb, the journey had been one of discovery, transformation, and unwavering commitment. They had navigated the complexities of their feelings, embraced the responsibilities of parenthood, and built a life filled with hope, love, and shared purpose. The giant cowboy who had once laughed at life's unpredictability now stood as a devoted partner and father, while the teacher who had once walked a quiet, predictable path became a confident, joyful mother and life partner. As the seasons changed and the child grew, the family flourished. They walked together along the river, tended the garden, explored the countryside, and cherished the small moments that made life beautiful. Their bond, forged through friendship, trust, and love, remained unshakable, a testament to the power of connection, patience, and courage. In the end, the story of Jeb Granger and Clara Benson was not just about a giant cowboy and a teacher. It was about two people who found each other against the odds, nurtured a relationship built on respect and care, and embraced life's surprises with courage and grace. It was a story of growth, transformation, and the quiet joy that comes from sharing life with someone who truly understands and cherishes you. Redstone would always remember the giant cowboy and the teacher, not for the size of one or the profession of the other, but for the love, commitment, and joy they brought to each other and to the world around them. And for Jeb, Clara, and their child, the story was just the beginning of a life full of shared adventures, laughter, and the simple, enduring happiness that comes from being together.